Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe and hit the notification bell. Don't forget to follow me on Twitter, Telegram, and Locals, Facebook. You can support me on Locals, Subscribestar, buy me a coffee, and also don't forget to check out my Substack. Chapter 8 of Wall Street and FDR. Wall Street buys the New Deal. Bernard Baruch, played a more effective role. Headquarters just didn't have any money. Sometimes they couldn't even pay the radio bill for the candidates' speeches. They had practically nothing to carry on the campaign in the critical state of Maine. Every time a crisis came, BM either gave the necessary money or went out and got it. The 1928 presidential campaign matched Governor Alfred E. Smith, a Catholic, with backing from Tammany Hall, and a collectivist coloring to his politicking against Herbert Hoover, a Quaker with a professed leaning to traditional American individualism and self-help. Herbert Hoover won by 21,302,000 votes to Smith's 15,016,000 votes. Well, where did the Wall Street banker philosophers place their support and influence in the Smith-Hoover election? On the basis of the accepted interpretation of the philosophy of financiers, their support should have gone to Herbert Hoover. Hoover promoted the dearly beloved trade associations, dearly loved, that is, by the financial and business community. Further, in American individualism, Herbert Hoover made it clear that the ideal for America was, in other words, no system of laissez-faire, but on the contrary, a regulated economy. On the other hand, the most vocal political member of the Wall Street financial establishment in 1928 was John J. Raskob, vice president of DuPont and of General Motors, and a director of Bankers Trust Co. and the County Trust Co. At the personal insistence of Governor Al Smith, Raskob became chairman of the Finance Committee of the Democratic Party. Raskob was also the largest single contributor, giving more than $350,000 to the campaign. What were the policy objectives sought by Raskob and his allies that made Al Smith so attractive a candidate? In 1928, the key elements of what became the National Recovery Program were given a public airing by John J. Raskob, Bernard Baruch, and other Wall Streeters. The promotion of Roosevelt's NRA actually dates from the 1928 Raskob speech made in the Al Smith presidential campaign. Although both Al Smith and Herbert Hoover depended heavily on Wall Street's Golden Circle for election funds, as we saw detailed later in this chapter, the DuPont Raskob-Baruch money was heavily on Al Smith. Smith, of course, lost the 1928 election for the Democrats, and Herbert Hoover became the Republican president. In spite of lukewarm Wall Street treatment, Hoover appointed many Wall Streeters to his committees and boards. Then in mid-1932, given the blunt choice between a national recovery program in the form of the swoop plan or less fascist policies, Hoover declined to institute corporate socialism, identified the swoop plan for what it was, and brought the wrath of Wall Street down upon its head. Consequently, we can trace and will trace in this chapter the Baruch proposals for NRA and the financial backing of the two presidential candidates in each election by Raskob, Baruch, DuPont, Rockefeller, and others of the financial elite. The main backing in each case went to the Democratic candidate willing to promote corporate socialism. In 1928, this was Al Smith, who was also a director of the Morgan-controlled Metropolitan Life Insurance Company. In 1930, it went to Roosevelt with the early bird pre-convention contributions from the 1932 Hoover-Roosevelt contest. This was followed in mid-1932 by a withdrawal of a great deal of Wall Street support from Herbert Hoover and the wholesale transfer of influence and money towards the election of Roosevelt. Subsequently, FDR did not abandon his backers. The National Recovery Act, with its built-in ability to coerce small businesses, was promised and in June 1933 became law. Let's look then more closely at these events and the related evidence. Bernard Baruch's influence on FDR. According to his own statements, Hugh Johnson, the administrator of Roosevelt's NRA, went through a training program in the 1920s under Bernard Baruch's tutelage. Johnson records this experience as follows. I doubt if anybody had any more direct or complete access to sources of information than BM. And he always gave me a free hand in the consultation and use of such scientists and experts as I might need. I was for several years the only research staff which he permanently maintained. That and what went before was a great training for service in NRA because these studies covered a considerable segment of the whole American industry and the experience with government link the two together. Johnson himself views the Raskov speeches of September and October 1928 in the Al Smith campaign as the start of Roosevelt's NRA. There was nothing particularly new in the essence or principles developed. We had worked out and expressed precisely the same philosophy in Al Smith's campaign in 1928. Al Smith, the 1928 Democratic presidential candidate, was, as we have noted, a director of Metropolitan Life Insurance, the largest life insurance company in the U.S., and controlled by J.P. Morgan, and the greater part of his campaign funds came from the Golden Circle in Wall Street. Bernard Baruch outlined the NRA plan itself on May 1st, 1930, an auspicious day for a socialist measure, in a speech in Boston. The content of NRA was all there: the regulation, codes, enforcement, and the carriage of welfare for the workers. It was repeated in Baruch's platform of June 1932, the one that Herbert Hoover refused to adopt. The NRA was presented again by Baruch in testimony before the Senate and in speeches before the Brookings Institution and at Johns Hopkins University. In all, Hugh Johnson counts 10 documents and speeches, all presented before the election of Roosevelt in 1932, in which we will be found the development of the economic philosophy of the 1928 campaign and of almost all that happened since. Of a part of this philosophy, NRA was a concrete expression. The following extracts from Baruch's May 1st, 1930 speech contain the core of his proposals. What business needs is a common forum where problems requiring cooperation can be considered and acted upon with the constructive, non-political sanction of government. It may have been sound public policy to forbid by law anything that looked to regulation of production when the world was in fear of famine. But it is public lunacy to degree unlimited operation of a system which periodically disgorges indigestible masses of unconsumable products. No repressive, inquisitorial, mediocre bureau will answer. We must have a new concept for this purpose, a tribunal invested like the Supreme Court with so much prestige and dignity that our greatest business leaders will be glad to divest themselves of all personal interest in business and there serve. Like the Supreme Court, also it must be absolutely non-political. It should have no power to repress or coerce, but it should have power to convoke conference, to suggest and to sanction or license such common sense cooperation among industrial units as will prevent our economic blessings from becoming unbearable burdens. Its sole putative power should be to prescribe conditions of its licenses and then to revoke these licenses for infringement of such conditions. Its deliberation should be in the open and should be wholly scientific, briefed like an engineer's report, and published to the world. Such a system would safeguard the public interest and should be substituted for the blind, inhibitory blankets of the Sherman and Clayton Acts. It is not government in business in the sense which is here condemned. It is only a relaxation of the grip government has already taken on business by the Antitrust Acts. There is no fallacy in restricting ruinous excess production, a policy which the federal government is now vigorously urging on agriculture. Yet, if there is nothing in the change of concept from bureaucratic precedent to that of an open forum where business can practice group self-government, acting on its own motion under sanction of non-political, constructive, and helpful tribunal, then the idea is not practicable. But that there is a possibility of such industrial self-government under governmental sanction was clearly demonstrated in May 1918. Many difficulties suggest themselves. In the first place, anything done in the elation and fever of war must be accepted as a criterion only with a caution. In the regulation of production price is one consideration, that is a subject which is loaded with dynamite. There are other obvious reservations, though the thought is revived at this critical moment because it seems worthy of consideration as an aid in threatening economic development of an unusual extent and as an alternative to governmental inference and vast extension of political powers in the economic field, an eventuality which in the absence of constructive action by business itself is almost as certain as death and taxes. Baruch wanted, by his own words, a resurrection of the trade associations, relaxation of antitrust laws, and control of business leaders, and cast the reader back to the War Industries Board of 1918. To be sure, Baruch suggests no power to coerce and open deliberations, but such protestations of good faith carry small weight in light of the economic history and past furious efforts to establish cartels and combinations and restraint of trade by this small group. It was to further this end that financial support for both Democrats and Republican candidates was forthcoming. the greater part of the financing originated in a relatively small geographic area of New York. Wall Street finances the 1928 presidential campaign. The direction of political support can be measured and identified by related financial support. The origins of the financial contributions to Smith and Hoover campaigns of 1928 can be identified, and we find, contrary to prevailing beliefs, that it was the Democrats who received the lion's share of funds from Wall Street. As we have seen, it was in the Democratic campaign that outlines the National Recovery Act were first promulgated by Baruch and Raskob. After the 1928 presidential election, the Steiwer Committee of the U.S. House of Representatives investigated the sources of campaign funds funneled into the election. The detailed information was published by the Steiwer Committee, but the Steiwer Committee did not probe into the corporate origins and affiliations of the contributors. It merely listed names and amounts contributed. Table 13 of the report is entitled Persons Contributing Sums of $5,000 and over in behalf of a Republican presidential candidate. The Republican presidential candidate was, of course, Herbert Hoover. The table lists full names and amounts contributed, but without the affiliation of the contributors. Similarly, Table 14 of the report is entitled Persons Contributing Sums of $5,000 and over in behalf of the Democratic candidate. Again, full names and amounts are given, but the affiliation of the persons are not stated. These lists were taken and matched by the author to the Directory of Directors in the City of New York, 1929-1930, where the contributor, as listed by Steiwer Committee, was identified as having an address with a 1-mile circle of 120 Broadway in New York. The name and amount contributed were noted. No notation was made of persons not in the directory and most probably resident outside of New York City. But a record was kept of the sums of money contributed by the non-New York residents. In other words, two totals were constructed from the Steiwer Committee data. Contributions from persons listed as directors of companies headquartered in New York and contributions from all other persons. In addition, a list of names of the New York contributors was compiled. In practice, the research procedure was biased against inclusion of New York-based directors. For example, in the Democratic Party list, Van Lear Black was listed by the author as a non-New York resident, although Black was chairman of the Fidelity and Casualty Co. The company had offices at 120 Broadway, and Franklin D. Roosevelt was the New York vice president in the 1920s. However, Black was based in Baltimore, therefore not counted as a New York director. Again, Rudolph Spreckels, the sugar millionaire, was listed in the Steiwer Committee report for a $15,000 contribution, but it is not listed in the New York total as he did not base himself in New York. Similarly, James Byrne contributed $6,500 to the Smith for President campaign, but is not listed as a New York director. He was director of Fulton Savings Bank in Brooklyn, outside of the 1-mile circle. Jesse Jones, the Texas banker, contributed $20,000, but it is not listed as a New York director because he was in Texas, not a New York banker. In other words, the definition of a Wall Street contributor was very tightly and consistently drawn. The major Wall Street contributors to the Al Smith for President campaign, 1928. Name: John J. Raskob, DuPont and General Motors. Deficit campaign, 1928 contributions. Deficit contributions: $110,000, $250,000, total $360,000. William F. Kenney, W.A. Harriman, $25,000, $100,000, $150,000, total $275,000. Herbert H. Lehman, $10,000, $100,000, $150,000, $260,000. M.J. Meehan, 120 Broadway, $50,000, $100,000, $150,000. Total $1,045,000. Sources adapted from Lois Overacker, Money in Elections, page 155. Under the restricted definition, the total amount contributed by Wall Street directors mostly connected with major banks to the Al Smith 1928 presidential campaign was $1,864,339. The total amount contributed by persons not within the Golden Circle was $500,531, which makes it a grand total of $2,364,870. In brief, the percentage of the Al Smith for President campaign funds coming from persons giving more than $5,000 and also identified as Wall Street directors was 78.83%. The percentage from donors outside the Golden Circle was a mere 21.17%. Looking at the total Al Smith contributors another way, the large contributors, over 5,000 to the Smith campaign, those in the best position to ask and receive political favors, put almost $4 out of 5. The identity of the larger contributors to both the Al Smith campaign and the Democratic National Committee fund is listed in the attached tables. Contributors of $25,000 or more to the Democratic National Committee January to December 1928, including contributions listed in previous table. Herbert H. Lehman and Lehman Brothers, FDR's political chief, $150,000. Edith A. Lehman, okay. John J. Raskob, Vice President of DuPont and General Motors, $110,000, NRA Administrator. Thomas F. Ryan, President, Bankers Mortgage Co., $75,000, Chairman, Restriction Finance Corps. Harry Payne Whitney, Guarantee Trust, $50,000 US. See Chapter 10, The Butler Affair. Pierre S. DuPont, DuPont Company, General Motors, Financier, $120, $50,000. See Chapter 10, The Butler Affair. Bernard Baruch, Financier, $120 Broadway, $37,590, NRA Planner. Robert Sterling Clark, Singer Sewing Machine Company, $35,000. See Chapter 10, The Butler Affair. John D. Ryan, National City Bank, Anaconda Copper, $27,000. William H. Wooden, General Motors, $25,000. Secretary of Treasury, 1932. Sources, Thyroid Committee Report. Contributions to the Democratic Presidential Primary, 1928, by directors of the County Trust Company. Name of director, contribution to campaign and deficit, other affiliations. Vincent Astor, $10,000. Great Northern Railway, U.S. Trust Co., Trust, New York Public Library, Metropolitan Opera. Howard S. Cullman, $6,500. Vice President, Cullman Brothers. William J. Fitzgerald, $6,000. Edward Kelly, $6,000. William F. Kenney, $275,000. President and Director, William F. Kenney Co., Director of the Aviation Corps, Chrysler Corps. Arthur Lehman, $14,000. Partner, Lehman Brothers. Director, American International Corps, RKO Corps, Underwood, Elliott Fisher Co. M.J. Meehan, $150,000, 61 Broadway. Daniel J. Mooney, D.J. Mooney, 120 Broadway. Oh, it doesn't tell you how much you spent. John J. Raskob, $360,000. Director, American International Corps, Bankers Trust Co., Christiana Securities Co., Vice President, E.I. DuPont, Numers & Co., and General Motors Corps. James J. Riordan, $10,000. Alfred E. Smith, Presidential Candidate Director, Metropolitan Life Insurance Company. Total, $842,000. Notes, the following directors of County Trust Company did not contribute according to the records: John J. Broderick, Peter J. Carey, John J. Kavanaugh, William H. English, James P. Geegan, G. L. Boulier, Ralph W. Long, John J. Pylian, and Perry D. Saylor. Includes, asterisk, includes contributions to the campaign deficit. Triple asterisk, excludes contributions by other members of the Lehman family to the Democratic presidential campaign that total $168,000. Look at the names in these tables. It would be neither unkind nor unfair to say that the Democratic candidate was bought by Wall Street before the election. Moreover, Al Smith was the director of the County Trust Company, and the County Trust Company was the source of an extraordinarily large percentage of Democratic campaign funds. Herbert Hoover's election funds. When we turn to Herbert Hoover's 1928 campaign, we also find a dependence on Wall Street financing, originating in the Golden Mile, but not nearly to the same extent as in Al Smith's campaign. Of a large donation total for Herbert Hoover of $3,521,141, about 51.4% came from within the Golden Mile in New York and 48.6% from outside the financial district. Contributions of $250,000 or more to the Republican National Committee, January to December 1928. Mellon family, Mellon National Bank, $50,000. Rockefeller family, Standard Oil, $50,000. Guggenheim family, Copper Smelting, $75,000. Eugene Meyer, Federal Reserve Bank, $25,000. William Nelson Cromwell, Wall Street attorney, $25,000. Otto Kahn, Equitable Trust Company, $25,000. Mortimer Schiff Bank, $25,000. Total, $275,000. Source, Steiwer Committee report. Herbert Hoover was, of course, elected president. His relationship to the rise of corporate socialism has been misinterpreted in both most academic and media sources. The bulk of liberal-oriented literature holds that Herbert Hoover was some kind of unreconstructed laissez-faire Neanderthal. But this view is rejected by Hoover's own statements, for example. Those who contend that during the period of my administration, our economic system was one of laissez-faire have little knowledge of the extent of government regulation. The economic philosophy of laissez-faire or dog-eat-dog had died in the United States 40 years before, when Congress passed the Interstate Commerce Commission and the Sherman Antitrust Acts. Mary Rothbard points out that Herbert Hoover was a prominent supporter of Theodore Roosevelt's Progressive Party, and according to Rothbard, Hoover challenged in a neo-Marxist manner the orthodox laissez-faire view that labor is a commodity and that wages are to be governed by laws of supply and demand. As Secretary of Commerce, Hoover pushed for government cartelization of business and for trade association, and his outstanding contribution, according to Rothbard, was to impose socialism on the radio industry while the courts were working on a reasonable system of private property rights in radio frequencies. Rothbard explains these ventures into socialism on the grounds that Roosevelt was the victim of a terribly inaccurate grasp of economics. Indeed, Rothbard argues that Hoover was the real creator of the Roosevelt New Deal. Although the evidence presented here suggests that Baruch and Raskob had more to do with FDR's New Deal, there is some validity to Rothbard's argument. Herbert Hoover's practical policies were not consistent. There are some pro-free market actions. There are many anti-free market actions. It seems plausible that Hoover was willing to accept part, possibly a substantial part, of a socialist program, but had a definite limit beyond which he was not willing to go. During the course of the 1920s, in the years after the formation of the American Construction Council, more than 40 codes of practice compiled by trade associations were adopted. When he became president, and in spite of his early associations with the ACC, Herbert Hoover promptly ended these industrial codes. He did this on the grounds that they were probably illegal associations to police prices and production and that no government could regulate them in the interest of the public. Then in February 1931, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce formed a group entitled the Committee on the Continuity of Business and Employment under Henry I. Harriman. This committee came up with proposals very much like those of the New Deal, that production should be balanced to equal consumption, that the Sherman antitrust laws should be modified to allow agreements and restraint of trade, that a National Economic Council should be set up under the auspices of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, and that provision should be made for shorter hours in industry, for pensions, and for unemployment insurance. This was followed by yet another Hoover committee known as the Committee on Work Periods in Industry under P.W. Litchfield, president of Goodyear Tire and Rubber Company. Then still another committee under Standard Oil Company of New Jersey, President Walter Teagle, recommended sharing work, a proposal endorsed by the Litchfield Committee. Then came the Swoop Plan in 1931, see Appendix A. The plans were forthcoming, but Herbert Hoover did very little about them. So under Herbert Hoover, while big business was prolific in publicizing plans designing to modify the Sherman Antitrust Act, allow for self-regulation by industry, and establish codes and restraint of trade, President Herbert Hoover did nothing to encourage these ventures. In fact, Hoover recognized the Swoop Plan as a fascist measure and recorded this in his memoirs, along with the melancholy information that Wall Street gave him a choice of buying the Swoop Plan, fascist or not, and having their money and influence support the Roosevelt candidacy. This is how Herbert Hoover described the ultimatum from Wall Street under the heading "Fascism Comes to Business," with dire consequences. Among the early Roosevelt fascist measures was the National Industrial Recovery Act of June 16, 1933. The origins of this scheme are worth repeating. These ideas were first suggested by Gerard Swoop of the General Electric Company at a meeting of the electrical industry in the winter of 1932. Following this, they were adopted by the United States Chamber of Commerce. During the campaign of 1932, Henry I. Harriman, president of that body, urged that I agree to support these proposals, informing me that Mr. Roosevelt had agreed to do so. I had tried to show him that this stuff was pure fascism, that it was merely a remaking of Mussolini's corporate state, and refused to agree to any of it. He informed me that in view of my attitude, the business world would support Roosevelt with money and influence. That, for the most part, proved true. Wall Street backs FDR for governor of New York. The chief fundraiser in FDR's 1931 re-election campaign was Howard Cullman, commissioner of the Port of New York and director of County Trust Company. Friedel lists the campaign contributions in 1931 without their corporate affiliations. When we identify the corporate affiliations of these contributors, we find once again that County Trust Company of 97th 8th Avenue, New York, had an extraordinarily large interest in FDR's re-election. Apart from Howard Cullman, the following major contributors to FDR's campaign were also directors of the County Trust Company: Alfred Lehman, Alfred Al E. Smith, Vincent Astor, and John Raskob. Another director was FDR's old friend Dan Riordan, a customer from Fidelity and Deposit days at 120 Broadway, and William F. Kenny, yet another FDR supporter and director of County Trust. To place this list in focus, we must remember that Friedel lists 16 persons as major contributors to this campaign, and of this 16, we can identify no less than 5 as directors of County Trust and 2 other enlisted directors as known FDR supporters. Other prominent Wall Streeters financing FDR's 1930 campaign were the Morgenthau family, with Lehman's the heaviest contributors. Gordon Rentschler, president of the National City Bank and director of the International Banking Corporation. Cleveland Dodge, director of the National City Bank and the Bank of New York. Caspar Whitney. August Heckscher of the Empire Trust Company, 120 Broadway. Nathan F. Jones, Manufacturers Trust Company. William Wooden of Remington Arms Company. Ralph Pulitzer, and the Warburg family. In brief, in the 1930 campaign, the bulk of FDR's financial backing came from Wall Street bankers. Contributors to Pre-Convention Express of FDR, $3,500 and over. Edward Flynn, $21,500, director of Bronx County Safe Deposit Co. W.H. Wooden, $20,000, Federal Reserve Bank of New York, Remington Arms Co. Frank C. Walker, $15,000, Boston Financier. Joseph Kennedy, $10,000. Lawrence A. Steinhardt, $8,500, member of Guggenheim, Untermeyer, and Marshall, 120 Broadway. Henry Morgenthau, $8,000. Underwood Elliott Fisher, F.J. Manchetti, $6,000. Lehman family, $6,000. Lehman Brothers, 16 Main Street. Dave H. Morris, $5,000, director of several Wall Street firms. Sarah Roosevelt, $5,000. Guy P. Helvering, $4,500. H.M. Warner, $4,500, director, motion picture producers and distributors of America. James W. Gerard, $3,500, financier, 57 William Street. Total, $170,500. Shortly after Roosevelt's re-election in 1930, these bankers started to raise funds for the 1932 presidential campaign. These early bird pre-convention contributions have been described by Flynn. These contributors who helped early when the need was so great thoroughly won Roosevelt's devotion that in most instances they ultimately received substantial returns in public offices and honors. Wall Street elects FDR in 1932. In 1932, Bernard Baruch was the key operator working behind the scenes, and sometimes not so much behind the scenes, to elect FDR with the money and influence of big business. See epigraph to this chapter. Further, Bernard Baruch and Hugh Johnson collected numerous statistics and materials over the 1920s decade, supporting their concept of national economic planning through trade associations. Johnson recounts how this information became available to FDR speechwriters during the Roosevelt campaign of 1932. Ray Moley and Rex Tugwell came up to BM's house, and we went over all the material that BM and I had collected and summarized in our years of work. They, with Adolph Burrell, had long before worked out the subjects of what they thought would be an ideal scheme of economic speeches for a presidential candidate, but they had few facts. From that moment, we joined Ray Moley's forces, and we all went to work to find Franklin Roosevelt, the data which he welded into a very remarkable series of simply expressed speeches on homely economics, which convinced this country that here was the leader upon whom it could rely. In rereading the FDR campaign speeches, it becomes obvious that they lack concreteness and specific facts. Presumably, the Moley-Tugwell team set out the general theme, and Baruch and Johnson introduced supporting statements in such areas as credit expansion, the consequences of speculation, the role of the Federal Reserve System, and so on. It was remarkable, but perhaps not surprising, that these Baruch-influenced speeches took the reader back to World War I, cited the contemporary emergency as greater than that of the war, and then subtly suggested similar Baruchian solutions. For example, at the Jefferson Day dinner speech of April 18, 1932, Roosevelt said, or was prompted to say, "Compare this panic-stricken policy of delay and improvisation with that devised to meet the emergency of war 15 years ago. We met specific situations with considered relevant measures of constructive value. There were the War Industries Board, the Food and Fuel Administration, the War Trade Board, the Shipping Board, and many others." Then in May 1932, Roosevelt addressed himself to the theme, "The country needs, the country demands, President's experimentation." He called for national economic planning. This speech was followed on July the 2nd, 1932, by the first hint of the New Deal. Finally, in accepting the nomination of the presidency at Chicago, FDR said, I pledge myself to a New Deal for the American people." Notes. Friedel's list of pre-convention contributors to Franklin Delano Roosevelt's 1932 presidential campaign. 1932 pre-convention contributors, over $2,000. James W. Gerard, Bowen, and Haplin. See Julian A. Gerard. Guy Helvering, Colonel E.M. House, New York. Joseph P. Kennedy, 1560 Broadway. Administrator to the Court of St. James in New England, Fuel and Transport Company. Henry Morgenthau, Sir Underwood Elliott Fisher, 11335 Avenue, Bank of New York and Trust Company. Assistant Comptroller, American Savings Bank Trustee. Dave Hennon Morris, Mrs. Sarah Delano Roosevelt, Hyde Park, New York, FDR's mother. Lawrence A. Steinhardt, 120 Broadway, Guggenheim, Untermeyer, and Marshall. Harry M. Warner, 321W West, 44th Street, motion picture producer and distributor of American Inc. William H. Hoodwin, Secretary of American Card Foundry, Remington and Arms Co. Edward J. Flynn, 529 Cortlandt Avenue, Bronx County Safe Deposit Company. James A. Farley adds to this list. William A. Julian, Director of Central Trust Co. Jesse I. Strauss, 1317 Broadway, President R.H. Mackey and Co., New York Life Insurance. Robert W. Bingham, publisher, Louisville Courier-Journal. Basil O'Connor, 120 Broadway, FDR's law partner. Chapter 9, FDR and the Corporate Socialists, the Swoop Plan. I think this is as revolutionary as anything that happened in this country in 1776, or in France in 1789, or in Italy under Mussolini, or Russia under Stalin. Senator Thomas P. Gore in the National Recovery Administration hearings, U.S. Senate Finance Committee, May 22nd, 1933. Although the New Deal and its most significant component, the National Recovery Administration, are generally presented as the progeny of FDR's brain trust, as we have seen, the essential principles had been worked out in detail long before FDR and his associates came to power. The FDR group did little more than put the stamp of academic approval to an already approved plan. The roots of the Roosevelt NRA are of particular importance, as we have seen in Chapter 6, allowing for vast changes in the industrial structure. NRA approximated a schema worked out in 1841 by FDR's ancestor, Assemblyman Clinton Roosevelt of New York. Then we noted that a wartime dictator, Bernard Baruch, was preparing an NRA-like program in the 1920s, and that he and his assistant, Hugh Johnson, were very much an integral part of the preliminary planning. Further, the Roosevelt NRA was in its details a plan presented by Gerard Swoop, 1872-1957, longtime president of General Electric Company. This Swoop plan was in turn comparable to a German plan worked out in World War I by his opposite number, Walter Rathenau, head of German General Electric, in Germany, where it was known as the Rathenau plan. So let's take a closer look at the Swoop plan. Okay, everybody, at this point, I think we'll stop for tonight. Thanks for watching. Let's see who we have. Cyber Ninja 0, GF, Record Deepness, and hello. Well, glad you're here, guys. Hello asks, why is this worthwhile? Well, Anthony Sutton demonstrates a series of interesting financial connections between groups that were considered to be hostile to each other, the communists in Russia, FDR, and Hitler and the Nazis, which leads to a very subversive understanding of the 20th century. Also, everyone, don't forget to tune in tomorrow night at 6 o'clock, where I will discuss my thoughts on this weekend's Feelings event, of which I'm still quite tired. So everyone, thank you for tuning in. This is Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast, signing off.